All right, Matt, you play pickup basketball from time to time, right?
I do.
Okay, what if somebody, say Elon Musk, or I don't know, picture this Warren Buffett, played wherever you play and was really good? You think you want to challenge them to a game?
I mean, yeah, that would be pretty cool. I think I'd definitely be nervous that I was going to get dunked on by a boomer in front of my friends.
Yeah.
But my guess is a lot of the guys challenging Vanderbilt to pick up horse races in the streets of Manhattan felt the same.
Hmm.
I mean, this guy's in his 60s and he's going uptown to race random guys on his horses just for the thrill and just to compete in something.
Yeah, just for the thrill. It's incredible, actually. My favorite is on Thanksgiving, 1857. Remember this one where he harnesses his horses and gets his carriage ready, and then he heads uptown with a friend to the place where people try to race each other. And it's almost like a scene from The Fast and the Furious where he gets there and he waits for somebody to challenge him. All these guys were always looking to beat Vanderbilt, except that day, nobody takes him on. And so Vanderbilt kind of turns around. He's disappointed. He's heading back into town. And then all of a sudden, like 10 or 15 of these guys are chasing after him, trying to pass him. But the road ends up being too narrow. And when they pick up speed, some of the wheels crash into each other and they crack. And there's this huge accident.
Yeah, right. I think by some miracle, no one gets hurt in that race. I think even Vanderbilt's carriage was fine because, of course, he's in the front, always winning. But he does get hurt a few times in these horse races. He'll basically do anything to win them. He gets seriously injured a few times trying to win these pickup horse races.
Yeah, Vanderbilt is the epitome of competitive, just relentless. All right, you ready to go?
Let's go.
Welcome to the 10th episode of Season 2 of Backtest, the podcast about defining moments in market history and their timeless lessons. I'm Daniel Gamboa.
I'm Matt Harris.
And we are your hosts.
Before we dive in, a quick reminder that this show is for informational purposes only, and it is not investment advice. Daniel and I may have investments in the companies discussed.
All right, Matt. So we laid out the technology breakthroughs in the UK in part 1. And then in part 2, we talked about the first CapEx boom, also in the UK, that sparked the big railway mania bubble. We're going to travel across the Atlantic now to the US because in trying to unpack the massive capital investment that railroads represented, as we're trying to extract the lessons that help us navigate markets today, one of the most important dynamics to understand how a cycle like this works is to understand how a technology like railroads completely rewires the economic engine, right? The rules of the game.
Yeah. I mean, this episode is gold for anyone who has read Innovator's Dilemma and wants to see an up-close example of someone who successfully navigated one of history's biggest technology cycles.
Right. You know that every business, right, every industry operates on a value chain. And, there's a network of suppliers that contribute to every piece of an end product. Think of something even as simple as a pencil, right? I'm going to borrow Milton Friedman's little story here from like the 80s. So you have the wood, you have the graphite, you have the eraser made of rubber, and then there's a company that puts it all together. There's companies that sell the pencil, right? Every product, really every market is kind of a network on a value chain, and everyone on that chain is competing for the profit pool that gets created by the gap between what the thing costs and what the customers are willing to pay for it. So really the fundamental question we want to ask today is what happens when a technology, in this case railroads, is so revolutionary that it breaks the old value chains for products and services and then fundamentally changes the rules of the game for the entire economy.
Yeah. Now I'm wondering who makes money in the pencil market. But you don't have to look very far today to imagine how disorienting and how hard it would be to have to reshuffle, how you make your product overnight, how you're making huge capital allocation decisions. Huge, right? Like the kinds that are measured in percentage of GDP, huge, without even really knowing exactly what parts of the value chain are going to be profitable.
Yeah. And if you read the book 7 Powers, which is a great read, in essence, I think what we're trying to understand is how you make decisions, right? How you strategize to build moats and to accumulate market power in a game with not just existential stakes, right? But without really any clearly defined upfront rules.
Yes. So this is a story of building moats in a new industry where there's still a ton of uncertainty. So you aren't just in a competitive race here. This isn't sort of regular way business. In this case, you're racing up a hill in a deep fog against other Olympic athletes, and there are just cliffs on both sides of you on the path that you're on.
Yeah, the ultimate game, right?
Yeah, it's the ultimate game. And we really have an epic story because this is the story of how Cornelius Vanderbilt, a truly relentless competitor.
Yeah, totally relentless.
Yeah, this guy's very competitive. He's already one of the wealthiest people in the U.S. by the time he focuses on railroads. He's actually already in his 60s at this point. And this is the story of how he shifts his focus from steamboats to railroads in the early 1860s, and how he basically invents the playbook for market power as he gradually comes to dominate the game at the very epicenter of the Industrial Revolution, which is railroads.
Yeah, and Matt, we need to give a huge thank you to TJ Stiles, whose Pulitzer-winning book, The First Tycoon, is an incredible resource for studying this period, and who was also kind enough to spend time with us, helping us unpack key parts of Vanderbilt's playbook here.
Yes, thank you to TJ. I actually just ordered a new copy of his book because I just absolutely shredded my old copy doing research for this episode, and it has a lot of really good maps that I want to use. So everyone needs to go get a copy of The First Tycoon and put it on their shelf and read it, of course.
Yeah, completely agree there. And before we dive into the story, also a quick thank you to our presenting sponsor, EQT Corporation.
At Backtest, we study market cycles because patterns from history rhyme. What you're about to hear is a story about navigating a market that's changing fast and how identifying bottlenecks makes all the difference, especially in infrastructure.
Yeah, that's exactly the dynamic playing out right now with AI and energy. And the company helping to unlock the natural gas to power the AI build-out is EQT, producing American natural gas to help deliver affordable, reliable energy at scale. All right, Matt, let's dive into the story here. So to understand Vanderbilt, the railroad man, first you actually have to go back and understand Vanderbilt, the steamship man. Vanderbilt's steamship business was global. He dominated several routes around New York and had routes going across the Atlantic to Europe too. But the best way to get a sense for where Vanderbilt is at the point in history when railroads are really taking off in the US, the best way is to drop into the middle of the Nicaraguan jungle in January 1850. So the California gold rush is in full swing at this point. Hundreds of thousands of people are rushing from the East Coast to San Francisco, and by far the fastest and safest way to get there is by steamship.
Yeah. I mean, if you want to consider the alternative to taking a steamship, you're talking about getting on a horse and riding for 4 to 6 months. You're going to get stuck in the Rocky Mountains in a winter storm. You're going to get exposed to a bunch of risks like just running out of supplies, getting robbed, exposed to heat and disease, and all kinds of scary animals. For me, that would be snakes. I would just be terrified of all the snakes.
No snakes.
Yeah, and this is versus sitting on a nice ship, drinking a cup of tea for most of the trip, and still getting there a month or two faster.
Yeah, and the ships are beautiful. It's a slam dunk to go by ship. You sail south, you cross Central America by land at some narrow point, and then you catch another steamship to the Pacific side. And so every route at that time went through Panama, and it's controlled by a handful of well-connected people who are charging a fortune. By this point, Vanderbilt has been operating boats for 3 decades, and he's exceptional at it. So he's got his own engine manufacturing facility. He's become very wealthy from all this. Vanderbilt sees an opportunity in all this demand for getting to San Francisco from the East Coast. He's been studying the maps, and he thinks there's a faster, cheaper crossing through Nicaragua, north of Panama. You sail up the San Juan River from the Caribbean, you cross Lake Nicaragua on a boat, and then it's a short overland stretch to the Pacific where you can get on another boat. So he knows how this works, right? He can do the math in his sleep. The Nicaragua route would cut about 10% of the distance. So it should be cheaper to operate because it's less fuel. It should be faster, which means he can undercut the Panama operators on price and improve the customer experience too. So he had been executing on stuff like this on the East Coast for years. That's part of why he's so wealthy. But there is a problem because the engineers he sends to survey the route come back and tell him, hey, there's no chance. This route is impossible. Like the San Juan River is too rough. It's too shallow. There are too many rapids. You just can't run a steamship through it.
After getting to know Vanderbilt through this research, I can just picture this room. Everyone is just accepting what the engineers are saying, which is that this is impossible. Nobody can do this. Meanwhile, Vanderbilt's there, his sideburns perk up, and he's just thinking, challenge accepted. Let's go.
Yeah, exactly, right? You can almost picture him raging at the engineers. He's actually a very intimidating guy. He's tall. He's got big shoulders, and he has his thick white sideburns that go down his cheeks that are probably a little weathered from when he captained ships and used to get in fistfights all the time. So Vanderbilt does not back down. He's basically like, oh yeah, give me that. He takes the papers from the guys. He's 55. He has captains that typically run his steamships. He's a couple of decades removed from operating them himself, but he's still got it. So he goes down to Nicaragua. He gets to the San Juan River, and immediately he runs into what the engineers warned him about. The rapids are super intense, just kind of torrents of water crashing around the rocks, and the ship is getting shoved backwards by the current. It's scraping against rocks. They're going to wreck. Vanderbilt steps up, shoves the pilot aside. He kind of takes the wheel himself. He ties down the safety valve, and then he pulls it on full steam, and he's just going full steam ahead. The boiler pressure starts redlining. Apparently, the way that it's described, and one of the things that I read is that the paddles of the boat are just like white knuckling the water just to try to get the ship to move forward. And Vanderbilt ends up forcing the boat through. And so you think he's kind of got it, but actually, no, they run into more rapids the next day as they're trying to work their way through. And now they actually get stuck. So Vanderbilt orders some of the crew members to tie ropes to the trees. They get out of the boat, tied ropes to the trees on both banks of the river, and they start winching the boat over the rocks.
I came across a Harper's Weekly article about this voyage. They quoted this guy. They said he was a tough old sea captain, and he basically is saying, I wouldn't do this again for all the money in the world.
Yeah.
That's the kind of trip this was.
This sounds absolutely crazy. And this is just one story, by the way, right? Vanderbilt does this over and over again. He's relentless, and he's on the edge of what everybody else thinks is technically impossible for most of his life. He just figures out how to get stuff done.
So this is a guy, he started out working in New York Harbor with his own sailboat business at the age of 16. And he spent 4 decades building himself into the most dominant force in American steamboats. And he understands everything about the business, from the engines to the operations to the best routes to the economics, even to how to play the weather, right? And it was really interesting for me to learn that he even designs the ships, right? He's one of the leading architects of steamships, including the largest steamship in the world in the 1850s, which he, of course, named the Vanderbilt.
Of course.
So, so that, again, he's super competitive. So the last thing people see as he's just steaming by them is his name.
Yeah. The Nicaragua route is actually a perfect example of all this. It's faster, right? It's cheaper than the Panama route. And Vanderbilt actually uses it to wage a brutal fare war against the operators of the Panama routes. He ends up cutting the fares all the way down to $35 compared to the $150 to $300 that the incumbents were charging. And he's crushing them, right? Eventually, his competitors in 1859 basically wave the white flag. They buy his ships, and get this, they actually agree to pay him tens of thousands of dollars a month just to stay out of the business.
His competitors would rather pay him to do nothing than compete against him. And this Nicaragua story is great, but I think it actually undersells really how fierce of a competitor this guy was. Because we didn't even get into how another American takes over Nicaragua, the country, and they seize Vanderbilt's assets. And Vanderbilt actually has to fund an army to fight back against this guy.
Yeah, Vanderbilt's actually fighting actual wars over his business and winning, right? But not just that. While he's putting the cherry on top of his steamship businesses and his engine works, Vanderbilt has actually been connecting some of them to railroads to improve his routes. So in part 2, we talked about the huge railroad boom in the UK in the 1840s. And the U.S. had started laying rail in the 1830s and into the 1850s too, but at a slower pace than the UK. In fact, Vanderbilt was the president of something called the Stonington Line that connected the end of his Long Island steamship line in Stonington, Connecticut, and carried passengers by rail north to Boston. Early on, railroads were kind of an accessory, a complement really to the core transportation solution, which at the time really was steamboats.
Yeah, so that's his focus, right? Vanderbilt was focused on his steamboat business all the way up until the 1860s when he's almost 70 years old, which was shocking to me. I had no idea this guy was this old when he got into railroads. But he did know the railroad business when he got into it. Coming into the 1860s, he was on 4 major railroad boards and had made a lot of smaller personal investments in a bunch of railroad companies.
So this is a classic innovator's dilemma scenario, right? Where the disruptive new technology kind of starts off as a sideshow. It's not a replacement at first. And one of the most important railroad investments actually that Vanderbilt makes is when he saves an old struggling railroad during the Panic of 1857, which is a railroad called the New York and Harlem Line, or really just the Harlem for short. And that railroad runs right through the center of Manhattan, and it goes north almost to Albany, New York.
Yeah, it's fun for me to discover through this that not only is this line still operational, it's the Metro North Harlem line. It's the train that I take into the city from Connecticut every day.
Matt, you were sending me pictures of this as you were on the train.
Yeah,
so excited.
It definitely changed. It made it more exciting for sure. And actually, the Harlem line is really the beginning of our story. And the way that Vanderbilt saves it in the Panic of 1857 is really a great example of how this guy operates. And it's a key moment for a longtime Vanderbilt frenemy named Daniel Drew. This guy who apparently he looked just like a country preacher. You know, he was tall, he was super thin, he wore plain clothes. For some reason, this guy always carried an umbrella, which I may steal. I don't know, that might work. Except he's actually this scheming Wall Street type who loves to manipulate stock prices.
Yeah, these guys had been fierce steamboat competitors in and around New York since like the 1830s, right?
Yeah, and so they went back and forth being enemies and allies. But in 1857, Vanderbilt is going to dominate this relationship. And so the situation is the Harlem can't pay its bills in 1857. It has a pile of short-term notes that are coming due that Drew has endorsed, and Drew is refusing to sign the renewals of the debt. So there's a financial panic. It's every man for himself. And the Harlem president, of course, is just freaking out. He goes to Vanderbilt and he asks him for money to bail out the railroad. And Vanderbilt tells him, go away and mind your business. I will send you the bonds. He kind of just brusquely says, I got this. Just leave it with me and go run your railroad. But the next thing Vanderbilt does is he calls Drew into his office, and Daniel Drew walks in. Vanderbilt's sitting there calmly signing his papers, and he tells Drew to come in and sit down and just sign the Harlem notes. And Drew is kind of taken back by this. He's a little scared, and he tells Vanderbilt he's not signing any of these notes. And Vanderbilt says, I'm going to do it. Even if it takes the coat off my back, I'm going to live up to my word, and you are too. And Vanderbilt forces Drew to live up to his word and sign them. And he later said Drew was almost crying, but he does get him to sign those notes.
Yeah, Drew is kind of a fair weather guy, and we'll see later, he's kind of a guy who likes to cheat to make a profit on the shares that he owns. In a lot of ways, he's the opposite of Vanderbilt. And Matt, I had always thought that Vanderbilt came in with a grand strategy to dominate railroads, but I was very surprised to learn that that was completely wrong.
Same here. The Harlem is really the beginning of his focus on railroads for the rest of his life. So fast forwarding a couple years after he exits the Nicaragua route, by the early 1860s, Vanderbilt has built one of the largest fortunes in America. Then the Civil War breaks out and everything changes. He sells his biggest ship to the Navy at a premium. He's also facing quite a bit of competition in his steamboat business, especially on his Atlantic routes against British ships that are being subsidized by the British government. So over the next couple of years, he sells off the rest of his steamships. And by the summer of 1864, he's out of the steamship business entirely. And all that capital, all that energy is now going to be flowing towards and directed at railroads. But he's actually not trying to build a giant monopoly. He starts buying Harlem Railroad stock in the bull market for railroads that started right after the Civil War began in 1861. And there are a few things about the Harlem that Vanderbilt has been watching from his front row seat in New York City. And actually, this is one of the railroad boards that he had been on for a few years. The first thing Vanderbilt likes about the Harlem is actually really basic. It's that it's already built and has been operating for well over a decade. At this point in U.S. rail history, the Northeast Rail Network is actually almost completely laid out. Standards are in place. And, no one is wondering if they're going to explode when they ride a train at above 20 miles an hour like they were when it was brand new in the 1830s.
Yeah, it's not just that the rights of way in the Northeast are in place, right? But trains are a pretty regular part of everyone's life by the 1860s there. Running railroads profitably, though, is completely different, right? No one has really figured out how to do this well. Back then, the only businesses with that much geographic scale were the cross-Atlantic shipping businesses, and the assets for those weren't fixed, and they cost an order of magnitude less to build, so fundamentally different.
This is basically what Vanderbilt sees when he looks at the Harlem Railroad. It works in that the trains have been running on time for over 10 years, but the business around it isn't working. It's unprofitable. It hasn't paid a dividend in a while, which that's what people really cared about at this time was dividends. And most people think it will never pay a dividend because it doesn't just have operational issues. It actually has a lot of corruption issues with the city and state government. And I'll just say that I personally really wanted this shift from steamboats to railroads to be some brilliant macro call that Vanderbilt was making.
Yeah.
I really wanted to uncover that Vanderbilt sold his steamboat business. He considered that he was probably near the end of his life at 70. He sat on his pile of cash surveying the investment landscape by considering risk-free British bonds at 3%, U.S. treasuries at 6%, paying interest in gold. He considered buying bank stocks, paying 8% dividends.
This is what your wealth manager would have told you.
I wanted to uncover, a letter where him saying, I really like that the rail network in the Northeast is already built and that railway growth was outstripping high Civil War inflation and that stickier freight revenues had overtaken passenger revenues. But that's just not how it happened. That is not how Cornelius Vanderbilt thought about the world and approached things. This guy is a founder and an operator at the very core. He's thinking about fixing problems and streamlining operations, competing and just crushing the competition. Really, that's what Vanderbilt thinks about.
Yep.
And the problem he sees that he can fix is the Harlem Railroad. So he buys 10% of the company, even though no one thinks the Harlem will ever pay a dividend. Actually, people in New York City are kind of laughing at Vanderbilt behind his back when he says he thinks the Harlem Railroad can be a great railroad if it's properly managed.
Right. All the brokers in Wall Street think it's funny Apparently, they say the certificates are only good for wrapping paper, which is a burn.
Yeah, I mean, said differently, Vanderbilt buying the Harlem is just not a consensus investment in the early 1860s. But while everybody else is really just myopic about, last quarter's dividend, Vanderbilt has full conviction because the Harlem Railroad is the only railroad with access to the heart of Manhattan, which is the largest port in the United States. And he knows from his steamboat days that strategic routes are what really matter. And Vanderbilt is confident that he can fix the issues with the Harlem and turn a profit to pay a dividend.
Yeah, he's not just confident. He just knows, right? He's done the impossible before. He'll take on anyone and anything, and he's going to stake his reputation on his ability to fix the Harlem here.
Vanderbilt's on the board. He owns 10% of the company, and he actually becomes president of the Harlem in 1863. And also on the board at this point is his frenemy, Daniel Drew, the guy he had forced to sign the notes that he made cry, and when Vanderbilt saved the Harlem back in 1857. And remember that Daniel Drew likes to play games with stocks so that he can make a ton of money. And the city of New York has recently granted the Harlem the right to build a streetcar line down Broadway. There's a lot of fighting over who gets that right, and Harlem wins it. And so the stock runs up on that news. And Drew actually goes behind Vanderbilt's back, and he cooks up one of his schemes, this time in partnership with the city politicians, including this guy named William Tweed, who will later become one of the most notorious corrupt politicians in American history. His nickname is Boss Tweed. And the plan is that Drew and the politicians, they're going to short the Harlem stock. Then the city council is going to revoke the Broadway franchise, and the stock's going to crash, and they're going to make a ton of money.
This is a director of the company that is going out and conspiring with politicians to destroy the value of his own company's stock. So needless to say, this is well before securities laws, right? It's a very different world.
Yeah, and so Vanderbilt has incredible information networks, and he hears about this, and he actually warns the council members that they're making a big mistake here by messing with his railroad, but they ignore him. And the council revokes the franchise, the stock drops from 83 to 73, and Daniel Drew and the politicians are all celebrating, but Vanderbilt is brooding over this, and so he goes to work. Before they can buy back and profit, he starts buying every share he can get his hands on, and the price just starts climbing.
Yeah, short squeeze.
For sure. And the politicians who shorted the stock have contracts that say that they now have to buy that stock back at prices way above where they sold it. And they come to Vanderbilt begging for mercy. Vanderbilt has all kinds of funny responses when people try to challenge him. In this case, with a straight face, he just says that he doesn't know who they are and he doesn't owe them anything. and then he wishes them a good morning and shows them the door. And so
cold.
So the corrupt politicians get absolutely smoked here. This is extremely embarrassing for them. And they surrender to Vanderbilt by restoring all the grants and licenses that they had revoked. And through this stock market battle, which is known in market lore as the Harlem Corner, Vanderbilt grows his position in the Harlem from owning 10% of the stock to owning 33% of the stock. And so now he's invested a material amount of his wealth in the Harlem Railroad. He's in control of the company, and he's determined to get the Harlem paying a regular dividend like other top railroads.
Vanderbilt's going to go to work here, put his head down and start fixing the operations of the Harlem, right?
Yeah, so now it's time to get to work, right? He owns his position, he's staked his reputation on it. And the first thing Vanderbilt does is restructure the Harlem's debt into something that was simple and had only very long-term maturities. Basically, he gets their finances in order and removes debt as a risk for the company because he knew it would hamper his operational flexibility as he went to work to fix it.
Yeah, and Matt, this shows up across his entire life, right? He likes to operate with strength. He doesn't want to be beholden to anyone. He's extremely conservative with that.
Yep. The second thing Vanderbilt is going to work on to fix the Harlem Railroad is his classic steamboat move. He's going to cut costs to only what is just absolutely essential. But this time he runs into a phenomenon that he hadn't had to deal with before, because there's a breakout of extremely high inflation caused by the government trying to finance the Civil War. And so just as he's buying a controlling interest in the Harlem, inflation is skyrocketing. And that basically made it impossible for him to run his classic playbook of cutting costs. And when you look at the numbers, he actually never cuts Harlem costs, and actually costs skyrocket from 1863 to 1865.
Yeah, Vanderbilt must have been infuriated by that, don't you think?
Yeah, but because of inflation, that's not going to work. What he can do in a high inflation environment is raise prices. And he does that particularly on freight, which is about 50% of Harlem's revenue. But it's not enough to get to profitability so that the Harlem can pay a dividend. So all the Harlem's costs are going up just as fast as freight prices. And the dynamics in the passenger market, which is the other half of the business, they don't allow him to raise prices really at all. And so he's stuck in this sort of inflationary trap. But there's one other thing Vanderbilt is working on to improve the Harlem Railroad. He's trying to increase volume as much as he possibly can. Because one really important thing to understand about railroad economics is that the cost to run a railroad is actually 2/3 fixed.
You have massive fixed assets with trains, rails, stations, engineers to operate all this, right? Fuel costs that you incur, even if the train isn't full. It's pretty different from steamboats that just move on the water and can change routes whenever they want.
Right. So the simplest path to profitability for the Harlem actually is to just run as many full trains as possible, even at very low prices. But the problem now is that the market for freight shipping and passengers that the Harlem connects to going north of Manhattan is just not growing that fast. The core market they have is just not growing fast enough for Vanderbilt.
Yeah, plus it's an expensive route to operate with steeper gradients, right? So trains use more fuel.
Yeah, I mean, the cost to operate the Harlem per mile of track, it actually just really jumps off the page when you compare it to other railroads all throughout the 1860s. So Vanderbilt's looking for some profitable growth for the Harlem Railroad. And the growth market for all railroads in New England in the mid-1860s is freight coming from the west. But he's looking at a map, and he sees that all the freight coming from the west to New York City is traveling on the Central Railroad, which is one of the 4 trunk lines in the United States. And the Central actually had multiple options for getting freight and passengers from Albany to New York City. One of them was the Harlem Railroad. But then there are 2 more. There's also a railway called the Hudson Railroad that ran down the west side of New York City along the Hudson River. And the last option that the Central had was actually a steamboat business called the People's Line, run by frenemy Daniel Drew, of course.
Of course.
And this one ran down the Hudson River to the ports in New York City. And all that really matters to the Central Trunk Line when picking a last mile service partner, the Harlem, the Hudson, or the People's Line, all that matters to them is price. But competing only on price for the Harlem is tough because inflation's going nuts and their costs are going up.
Yeah, you can't have a price war in a high fixed cost business with no scale, right? That's a one-way street to bankruptcy.
Exactly. And this is a pervasive problem across the whole industry. But Vanderbilt sees it and he can actually do something about it. So he decides that competition with the Hudson Railroad and the People's Line is ruining the Harlem Railroad Company, and that he'll never get the Harlem profitable if he doesn't do something to get more power in the market.
Yeah, he's frustrated, right? He's competing for effectively a fixed pie of demand with no market power, and he has no ability to impose his will on competitors here, or even to just outcompete them by offering a better route or better service. He's basically a commodity on the route to New York from Albany. So he's tapped out on what he can do operationally to squeeze more out of the Harlem on his own. So there's really only one thing that he can do. He has to work with what he has. He goes to the president of the Central, this guy whose name is Erastus Cornyn, who happened to be about the same age as Vanderbilt. And he's also a wealthy, self-made man. They have a lot of respect for each other. Corning is one of New York State's leading businessmen and politicians of the time. And more importantly, Cornyn is the source of power in this market, really. He decides how he's going to route traffic south to New York. And of course, Vanderbilt wants to lobby him to split the freight traffic more evenly with the Harlem.
So far, that's not what the Central is doing. They're actually shipping mostly on the steamboats, except during the winter when the river freezes. And they typically choose the Hudson River Railroad over the Harlem when the river's frozen.
Yeah, exactly. And these are high fixed cost businesses, like you said, right? So even getting freight at bad rates is better than getting no freight at all. And Vanderbilt is willing to take losing rates just to keep the Harlem's trains running. That's how weak his market position is here. And then things get worse. In late 1863, a Wall Street guy named Addison Jerome, whose brother, by the way, Leonard, not an important character in the story, is one of the flashiest speculators on the street. And fun fact, also the future grandfather of Winston Churchill.
Nice.
Yeah. So anyway, Jerome is on the Hudson River Railroad's board. He's thinking the same as Vanderbilt. He wants more of the Central's traffic on his railroad. So Jerome puts together a scheme to take control of the Central. He's thinking, if I control the Central and force all freight down the Hudson River Railroad year-round, I'm going to solve my traffic problem. And of course, on the other side of that, Vanderbilt and Harlem would probably face massive losses.
Yeah, so this really backed Vanderbilt into a corner, and his response kind of reminds me of when I watched that Michael Jordan documentary that we all watched during COVID, The Last Dance, when he's telling the story about how his GM thought this other player on the Suns was better than him. And in the documentary, Michael Jordan, he pauses and he looks up and he says, "And I took that personally."
Favorite moment, of all time.
That's Vanderbilt at multiple points in his life. Certainly here, personal honor was a huge thing for him. He's nothing if not proud, and he said he's going to fix the Harlem, so he's definitely not going to do it without putting up a fight.
Yeah, that's a perfect way to think about Vanderbilt, actually. And so he reaches out again to the Central's president, Erastus Corning. He calls Corning a man of business and a gentleman. And Vanderbilt does not say that about many people, Matt. So he offers to help fight off Jerome's takeover, starts buying Central stock and gathering proxies from other investors in the Central. And Vanderbilt even writes him a letter that says, and I'm paraphrasing here from his terrible spelling, he basically says, "If I can be of service, just say so."
And this is another spot in the story where we learn that guys like Vanderbilt had these incredible information networks. And he sends out one of his lieutenants to gather intel at brokerages and clubs and horse racing tracks. And it's this banker named James Banker, which is hilarious as he's Banker. That's actually his name.
Yeah, I love that. So yeah, with the intel from Banker, Vanderbilt helps Cornyn win the election. And in return, he gets Banker a seat on the Central's board. And Banker is Vanderbilt's guy. So he expects the Central to start leaning now towards the Harlem. But the problem is the Harlem doesn't really have much to offer to the Central, right? The Harlem is just inferior. And there's really no commercial reason to shift traffic to the Harlem. In fact, the Central has its own competitive dynamics to think about, and it has its own political dynamics in Albany to also take into account. And so Vanderbilt, again, is kind of backed into a corner, and he only has one option left. He's got to go after the Hudson River Railroad directly now. So he threatens to build a competing line down the west bank of the Hudson. He joins forces with his frenemy, Daniel Drew, to build a short railroad where steamboats could connect, even in the winter, and try to undercut the Hudson Railroad's revenue. And remember, Daniel Drew's managing the People's Lines. His interests are aligned with Vanderbilt here. And so Vanderbilt's endgame here is really to weaken the Hudson Railroad's stock price. And of course, as the price starts dropping, Vanderbilt starts quietly buying shares.
Really important that Vanderbilt pretty much always tried diplomacy first in this part of his career. But in this case, it didn't work. And now he knows he has to control both lines to make it all work. So now he's going to go for the throat.
Exactly. And Vanderbilt described this later in some testimony that he gave. He said he was frustrated that these railroads kept clashing with each other and competing against each other. And so he buys Hudson stock little by little until he controls enough of it to take the board. And in June 1864, he removes the old Hudson board, including Jerome and the old guard, and he installs his own guys, including James Banker, by the way. And so naturally, by the next month, the executive committee gets together and they vote to end all competition between the Hudson and the Harlem.
Boom. And now the Harlem actually can pay a dividend because it's not in a price war with the Hudson, and Vanderbilt wins again, right?
Yeah.
Everything's good.
Everything's great, right? Right?
Not so fast. Not so fast. So Vanderbilt now controls both railroads into Manhattan, and he can stop them from cannibalizing each other. There's actually one more piece of infrastructure that needs to go on the board before he locks in real market power. And that piece falls into place in 1866 when they open a bridge across the Hudson River at Albany that for the first time allows trains to roll directly onto the Hudson's tracks without being unloaded or transferred.
Yep.
Loading and unloading trains was one of the biggest expenses on a railroad. But the Central actually keeps shipping on Daniel Drew's People's Line anyway, even though this bridge is in place. And it turns out that there was some entrenched local political interests inside the Central that wanted to keep shipping by steamboat. And they were almost finished with this project that you mentioned earlier that would make it so the Central could ship by steamboat all year.
Yeah. So the war's not over yet, right? So Vanderbilt hasn't really solved what he set out to solve with all this, the inefficiency, the fragmentation, and really the lack of profitability of these railroads. He's basically discovering the next layer of some root cause as he goes along, right? Like almost like these are nested dull problems he's going through, and he keeps having to work up market to just try to find some market power. And he's relentlessly competitive and ambitious. And so I think he's really just expanding his understanding. He's learning the problem with every move that he makes. This is huge, though, this part, because at this point in the story, the insight is that he figures out the most important part of the value chain is really the Central.
That's right. It's really a huge moment. At this point, he's not just thinking like a master operator. Now he's also thinking about the broader system, which makes this the perfect time to thank our presenting partner, EQT Corporation.
Yeah, if you think about transportation into the ports around New York at the time as a supplier and as a passenger, right? You had options, all of them providing reliable service at a great price.
Yep. There was ample infrastructure, which in a nutshell is the point EQT makes in their affordability analysis. When infrastructure doesn't keep pace with demand, prices rise.
That's right. That's why EQT is helping to educate consumers and policymakers on what drives affordability in electricity markets across the US. If you look, since 2020, communities across New England and California have seen electricity prices rise roughly 3 times faster than the rest of the country, primarily because of restrictions on construction to be able to transport supplies from where they are to where they're needed.
To solve something, first you have to understand how it works. EQT prepared a compelling study that you can check out to learn more at eqt.com/energy-affordability. Big thanks to EQT for helping us bring you the stories of market history and how they apply today. So back to the story. Vanderbilt had assumed that the Albany Bridge and the mandate that the Hudson and Harlem coordinate their businesses would solve all his problems. And removing cutthroat competition with the Hudson does actually go a long way with the Harlem Railroad. You can see it in their financials. In 1866, Harlem pays an 8% dividend, which is great for a railroad at that time. People are praising Vanderbilt for pulling off what looks like a miracle with the Harlem.
He's already the most highly regarded operator and capitalist, right, because of his steamboat past, and this just keeps adding to the lore now with railroads.
Yeah, so his reputation as a great railroad operator is growing, but the numbers are coming in, and 2 things are crystal clear for Vanderbilt. One is that the Harlem still doesn't have access to the growth markets he really wants, all the cattle and veggies and manufactured goods coming in from the Midwest. And even worse, Vanderbilt sees that the Hudson's traffic has flattened out and that he's actually going to have to cut the Hudson dividend in 1865 at a time when that's really all investors cared about was getting their dividend.
Yeah, we should note here, Matt, too, that a company's value back then was really tied to how much capital had been invested to build out its assets, basically the book value of the business. In fact, we'll put a recent Wall Street Journal article by TJ Stiles, the author of The First Tycoon, in the show notes that dives into this topic. Most investors hated the idea of intangible value or really paying for anything that wasn't a real asset. We're not going to get into it too deeply in this story, but Vanderbilt is pretty key in actually moving financial markets towards more abstract and powerful ideas about the value of pricing power and brand and strategic assets well beyond what they cost to build.
Yeah, and access to Western markets for these railroads is really as strategic as it gets. And so Vanderbilt's sitting there, and he's surprised by the simple fact that the numbers are screaming at him. Even with the Albany Bridge in place, the Central Trunk Line keeps choosing the steamboats to ship freight and passengers to New York City. And Vanderbilt knows this is an existential issue for the Hudson because it's cutting the Hudson out of really its only market during months when the Hudson River wasn't frozen near Albany.
Right. And remember, you mentioned earlier that there's a plan where pretty soon steamboats might actually be able to run year round with a connection a little further south in Hudson.
And just like when Vanderbilt owned the Harlem and he was trying to solve his problems with the Hudson, his first impulse is to be diplomatic and to try to find a win-win solution for everyone involved. In this case, he's especially drawn to this solution because this guy, Dean Richmond, became president of the Central in 1864. And Richmond is this huge, poorly educated guy who really clawed his way to the top. Sound familiar? Just like Vanderbilt.
Yep.
Actually, they're old friends, and there's a lot of mutual respect between them. So Vanderbilt sees no reason why they can't figure this out together. So Vanderbilt reaches out to Richmond and offers to lease the Harlem and the Hudson to the Central. Basically, he's saying he would let Richmond operate both lines as part of the Central system in exchange for a 10% and an 8% dividend for each line.
Yeah, this is classic Vanderbilt. You see him run this play back in his steamboat days over and over again, where he's effectively getting paid not to compete, to do nothing, right? Which is so different from the perception you would have if you just think of him as a robber baron trying to monopolize all railroads. Very different.
Yeah. And this is a good proposal, right? It really is a win-win for everybody. And Richmond's considering it. It makes sense. He's probably leaning towards doing it. And, maybe this whole story in Vanderbilt's railroad career is about to have a neat, pragmatic, happy ending.
Oh, nice. We're done.
Nope. Actually, we're not done because Dean Richmond drops dead in his sleep at the age of 62 before this deal gets done. This creates an enormous power vacuum at what is one of the most powerful companies on the planet. And when Richmond dies, that lease deal falls apart. And Vanderbilt needs someone he trusts in Albany to negotiate a new arrangement with the Central's interim leadership. So he actually taps his oldest son, William. Vanderbilt had written off his son, William, for years.
Yeah, to say the least.
Yeah, he had a very, tenuous family and home life. And so for William, he'd actually sent him to a farm on Staten Island after William had a breakdown as a young man. Vanderbilt calls him a sucker as late as 1856. But William had quietly built that farm into a real business, which shocked everybody. And he'd taken over as president of the Staten Island Railroad and proved he could operate. He was good.
Yeah.
So by this point, Vanderbilt trusts William enough to make him vice president of both the Hudson and the Harlem. And he sends William up to Albany in mid-October, right at the peak of fall, to cut a deal with the Central.
Beautiful time of year to ride that line, by the way.
Oh, yeah. It's like one of the prettiest in the world, even today. It's right along the Hudson River the whole time. The leaves are all around him. They're bright red and orange. But I doubt William is looking out the window because he's going up there to lodge a complaint, right? And he gets there. He sits down with Central management. He says, guys, look, we're spending a ton of money maintaining all these facilities on our rail, and you guys are only using them for a few months a year. So you should be paying us some kind of concession so the facilities you need in the winter are ready to go when you need them. And the response from the interim Central leadership is interesting. They basically agree with William and tell him to name a number. And William says $100,000 a year. And, William's kind of new at this, so he doesn't think anything of it when the Central leadership, they don't even talk about it. They don't even look around the table for a nod. They just sort of jump across the table and take the deal. And, maybe William's happy with himself on this beautiful train ride back to New York City. But when he gets home and he tells his dad about the deal for $100,000 a year from the Central, Vanderbilt basically eviscerates him for doing what he thinks is a terrible deal.
Yeah, it sounds like he could have gotten maybe 5 times that, or at least that's what Vanderbilt thought at the time. That's what we know.
Right, but it's a done deal, and it's a starting point for diplomacy. It's something that Vanderbilt can work with, and he just starts working on the deal that they have and that they've agreed to. He's tacking things on here and there, trying to make it better and more fair for the Hudson. But that power vacuum left at the Central when Dean Richmond died is still completely unresolved. And December 1866, this is just 2 months after the $100,000 deal was put in place, a group of Vanderbilt enemies buys up a bunch of the stock, and they take control of the board of the Central Railroad. And the very first thing they do immediately is they revoke that contract between the Central and the Hudson. And they make very clear that they're going all in on the steamboats, and this creates a truly existential threat for the Hudson.
Yeah, and some of them are explicitly trying to take Vanderbilt down, right?
Yeah, Vanderbilt's an old man, and he was very competitive in business, so he's got enemies. And some of them just took control of the Central. But believe it or not, Vanderbilt still wants to find a diplomatic solution between the businesses, even after the Central Board revokes the contract and throws a few other punches. Vanderbilt did sell all his Central shares in response to this. He owned about 2.5% of the Central at this point. But he's definitely not on a warpath in terms of finding a business solution and treating the Central as a valuable business partner. And so after the holidays, now we're into early 1867, he sends William back to Albany to try to find a new win-win for everybody. It's early January 1867. It's not a pretty ride anymore, right? It's a barren wasteland of snow. And it's gray and it's choke on the air cold in Albany when William meets with the new Central leadership. And he opens the meeting very cordially. He just says, guys, I want to do what's right for all parties here.
What a nice guy.
Yeah. But the Central leadership was not interested in a new deal. Actually, they respond to William by coldly saying, I have about made up my mind that your father does not know what is right and what is wrong.
Oof.
Which, that's like a 19th century version of making fun of someone's mama, right?
These are fighting words for sure.
And so William returns to New York City with no deal. He's still hopeful when he meets his dad, but Vanderbilt just isn't having it. He puts a fuse on the deal. He says if there's no agreement in the next few days, he's going to go nuclear. And he's going to sever all connection between his railroads and the Central Railroad. And on January 18th, 1867, Vanderbilt actually does this, right? He actually suspends all connections between the Hudson and the Harlem Railroads with the Central.
Full nuclear.
And remember, this is the middle of winter. So that means there's no way for freight or passengers to get to New York City from Albany. Passengers are actually having to get out of the train and walk across the frozen river, which is just nuts. This is a complete apocalypse for the Central and for the Hudson, right? This is very much a nuclear option for both companies. And it's the polar opposite of the diplomacy Vanderbilt had tried. You got to remember, guys like Vanderbilt had incredible information networks at this time. And he knew that at this particular moment, his little railroad had one advantage over the Goliath Central Railroad. And it's that the anti-Vanderbilt party that had bought control of the Central in 1866 had actually bought their shares using debt. And he knew they'd be forced to sell their stock if Central's stock price went down too much.
Ooh, exposed.
And so given that it's mid-January and the Central has no way to get freight or passengers to market, of course, the stock price tanks. And then it tanks some more because the controlling owners that had bought on margin and they're all having to fire sell into the secondary market.
Yeah, if you come for the king, you best not miss, right? He basically shut them down single-handedly and without any real notice. And this is a nightmare operationally, but it's Armageddon for the Central directors because they're all getting margin called and they're having to fire sale their shares.
So by January 19th, just one day after the suspension goes into effect, the Central leadership is begging Vanderbilt for a truce, and they are dying for a meeting to find that win-win that Vanderbilt wanted just 10 days ago. And his initial response when they're begging is he tells them that he's busy playing cards with his friends.
Cold-blooded.
What he's really doing, he is playing cards. He played cards a lot, just like he raced horses.
Yep.
But he's also buying all their shares as they're fire selling them because they're getting margin called. And he's buying in size, right? Not small. He's trying to make moves here. And remember, he had just sold his shares at a much higher price. So this is like an incredible trade, probably one of the best trades of the sort of railroad rollout era.
Mm-hmm.
But Vanderbilt does finally meet with the Central leadership, and the suspension ends a few days after it started, and a truce is put in place. And the terms of the truce are that when the Hudson sends the Central a full car, the Central has to send a full car back. The Central also agreed to pay its share of Hudson's terminal charges, which were some of the Hudson's biggest costs. And finally, the big one, the real coup, the Central agrees to stop using the steamboats instead of the railroads.
Yeah, this is a complete victory for Vanderbilt.
On top of all that, as you can imagine, the anti-Vanderbilt leadership resigns in disgrace just a few months later. And Vanderbilt and his friends are buying more and more Central stock all throughout 1867, working their way towards a control position in the Central Railroad.
Yeah, so as Vanderbilt's taken over the Central over the course of 1867, and he's really approaching the peak of his power with control over the biggest trunk line in New York, the Central, and control over the Harlem and the Hudson, he starts to worry about a very specific type of market risk. And once again, it's his frenemy coming back, Daniel Drew. Remember that Drew runs the People's Line steamboats on the Hudson, but he's also the treasurer of the Erie Railroad, which is the other trunk line in New York. 2 of the 4 trunk lines in the U.S. at the time were both in New York. And Drew has a habit of manipulating stock prices to make money, right? He loves to find something that will make the company share price go down, and often something that he can control. Basically, he's hurting his own company just so he can make money. And remember that Vanderbilt has known Drew for decades. He knows that this is how Drew operates. He knows that he likes to play a rigged game. And Vanderbilt hates one particular move from Drew's playbook, which is to take huge sums of cash out of the banking system on purpose to lock up funds. This is actually called a lockup. And then Drew would often do this. He would create a money shortage in the market to crash stock prices on purpose and make money on his shorts.
And he would do this specifically in the fall when there was more demand for money than at other times in the year because the 1860 U.S. economy is still very, very agriculture based. And the fall is harvest season. So a lot of money is flowing from New York City to the countryside to pay for those crops. So because money was so scarce back then, and there was high demand for money at this time of year, this move would drive up interest rates and make money markets really tight and make stock prices fall. It's crazy to think about, but there just wasn't much money around at this time. You know, New York City actually had only about 12 million of total bank reserves.
Yeah, this guy, Daniel Drew, is kind of a master of the 1800s Wall Street dark arts. Actually, there's someone who ends up being much better than he is, and we're going to meet him in a minute. Vanderbilt needs a healthy market to finish his takeover of the Central. He's buying Central shares along with his allies who are not quite as liquid as he is, and they're having to borrow money to do this. And of course, if Daniel Drew crashes the market, they're going to get wiped out. And Vanderbilt's reputation, more important to him, as the guy who makes stocks go up is on the line. And so in the fall of 1867, Vanderbilt is worried that Drew is going to short Erie stock, maybe try a lockup, and he's going to crash the market. And so Vanderbilt has to defend his play on the Central. So he joins a group that's trying to kick Drew off the Erie board.
And this group is really unrelated to what Vanderbilt cares about, right? This other group is run by some guy from Boston who wanted to take control of the Erie from Drew so the Erie would buy the Boston Railroad's bonds, right?
That's exactly right. And you remember who comes to Vanderbilt to ask for his proxy? Do you remember this? From the voting rights to his shares to get Drew removed from the Erie board in early October 1867?
Jay Gould.
Exactly. Yeah, T.J. Stiles describes Jay Gould as a small, slender, reserved young man with a great black sack of a beard. So you can picture that. And at this point, Jay Gould has had a couple of years on Wall Street. He's still a pretty low-key operator. He's young. He's 31. He's not the leader of this faction that's trying to remove Drew from the Erie board. He's just the director that's going around collecting proxies. So this play works out great for Vanderbilt because Drew's beaten after this. He can't recover from it. And 2 days before the board election in October 1867, Drew shows up at Vanderbilt's house. This is a recurring theme, right, of people coming to ask for mercy. And we don't know what Drew said that night. Nobody knows, but it somehow worked. Actually, Vanderbilt, for the first time in our story here, he changes his mind, and Drew gets back on the board through a resignation a couple of days later. And the old frenemies, these guys who have known each other for decades, they partner up on a campaign to drive Erie stock higher. Drew is managing the money. Vanderbilt's guys are in the pool. Everything seems fine.
Don't forget that while this is going on, Vanderbilt is laser focused and spending most of his time on his growing position in the Central. Around the same time is when he sends James Banker on an inspection tour of every machine shop, every ticket office, every set of books along the entire line. And he's firing underperformers. He's eliminating patronage jobs. He even bans brass ornamentation on locomotives because he doesn't want the crews to spend their time polishing them.
Brilliant. Yeah, the signs of a master operator, right?
He even tells his treasurer outright, he says, act like an owner, right? That's a big thing for Vanderbilt.
Yeah. Well, and then in January 1868, Daniel Drew kind of stabs him in the back. It turns out that while Drew was buying Erie for the pool with everybody else's money, he was secretly selling all of his own Erie stock, millions of dollars worth. He was betting the stock would fall. And then he suddenly declares that the pool is over and the Erie share price starts to drop. And on top of that, the Erie board starts negotiating with another railroad to lay track that would directly compete with the Central for traffic from Chicago, from those Western growth markets.
Yeah, and if Vanderbilt were here, he would look down at his iPad and he would say, and I took that personally.
That's right, yeah. Pride kicks in big time. And Vanderbilt now is raging. He wants revenge. He's furious. Drew cheated him and his friends, and he's undermining the market, and he's threatening the Central. And T.J. Stiles makes this point in the book, which is important to note. Vanderbilt doesn't want to take over the Erie. He says so himself. It's too big, and he doesn't have time for it. What he really wants here is revenge. He orders his brokers to buy every share of Erie they can find. He's going to squeeze Drew's short position. He's going to go scorched earth and destroy him. But the way this looks from the Erie director's perspective is very different. They think that Vanderbilt is coming for control. Everybody is pretty keenly aware at this point of Vanderbilt's playbook in Manhattan with the Harlem and the Hudson. And now that he's taking control of the Central, they kind of extrapolate that he might want to do the same thing and control the parallel trunk line to Buffalo, the Erie. And everyone fears Vanderbilt, right? He's relentlessly competitive. We've talked about this, and he's the strongest position on the board at this point with all his capital and his track record. So they panic and they fight back. They start printing stock. They issue millions in convertible bonds. They dump the fresh shares into the market to try to drown Vanderbilt's purchases. And every share that he buys, they create two more. And then more than that, Drew executes the exact move Vanderbilt was trying to prevent, the lockup. So the Erie board pulls millions in cash out of the banks, credit freezes up, and stock prices start tanking. And then the judge who had been backing Vanderbilt in his lawsuit against Drew that he had filed issues citations for the entire Erie board. So on the morning of March 12th, there's this crazy scene where the directors of one of the largest corporations in America are in the office just grabbing whatever documents they can carry. They're stuffing their pockets with cash and with bond certificates, and they're running for the ferry to New Jersey to get out of the state.
This is really an incredible scene. I can picture them just scrambling in the office. They're grabbing whatever they can. They're running out. They're kind of scared, but they're also all laughing about how ridiculous this is and how they're going to get away. This is like a scene from Catch Me If You Can. I mean, don't two of these guys get chased out of Delmonico's onto a rowboat?
Yes, Jay Gould is one of those, actually. They end up rowing across the Hudson to New Jersey in a fog and almost get run over by a steamboat. It's a complete circus. But Drew is miserable in New Jersey. He misses New York. On Sundays, he's sneaking back to Vanderbilt's house, talk about a deal. And eventually they do work one out. Vanderbilt sells back about 50,000 of his shares in the Erie. He actually insists that Drew personally be the buyer. He doesn't want to sell them to the Erie. Drew does end up paying about $500,000 out of his own pocket. And then the Erie kind of secretly funds the rest, the other $3.5 million. Plus, there's another $1 million that they pay Vanderbilt for the option to buy the rest of Vanderbilt's shares. Drew ends up resigning from the board. Gould takes over running the Erie as president. And Vanderbilt walks away with most of his money back. His losses were probably around $1 million, which he could absorb. But the damage to Vanderbilt isn't so much capital losses from all this. It's that for the first time, someone beat him. So he got outmaneuvered by Drew and especially by Jay Gould and another colorful director, this guy, Jim Fisk. And Vanderbilt's kind of made to look like a would-be monopolist in the press. So for a guy as competitive and proud as Vanderbilt, and for somebody playing this massive game of railroad capex and massive operations the world has never seen outside of major wars, he really kind of loses the air of invisibility in the market, which is one of his most powerful assets in this game.
This is tough for Vanderbilt, but he's not missing a beat with his plans for the Central, and he's not sulking. Right as the Erie War is playing out, Vanderbilt had been named president of the Central in December 1867. And speaking of reputation, everybody really wanted this, right? And they're actually asking him to accept the position because he's viewed as honest and honorable and a great operator. And with that, he's really dialed in because now he finally has a system with actual market power and can overcome the issues he ran into when he only controlled the Harlem and the Hudson. Now he has the scale to optimize his high fixed costs and the ability to optimize prices and logistics. And so it's very clear that Vanderbilt believes it's time to invest in his existing network. And so right when the Erie War is in full swing between 1867 and 1868, the Hudson is actually raising equity. Vanderbilt's going to double the size of the existing investment in the Hudson to build new terminals, buy rail cars, double the track lines, upgrade to steel, and even lay down some new lines that are very strategic.
Yeah, you can see this show up in the financials, right, Matt? At the end of the price wars and the higher traffic, you see the Hudson dividend get back to around 8%.
You can see in the numbers that Vanderbilt's able to run his classic cost-cutting and streamlining play on the Central's operating performance is improving very quickly because now Vanderbilt has real market power. And so Vanderbilt, after 5 years of relentless learning and maneuvering, he finally has control of the Central trunk line, and it's only 2 entry points into Manhattan. And the newspapers are calling him the Railway King.
Throwback to the George Hudson days. This is a very different type of Railway King.
Yeah. And so to circle back to the outcome of the Erie War, there's no evidence that Vanderbilt is really unhappy with the outcome here. In fact, he seems pretty happy with the compromise. But he did lose a valuable piece because the market, his competitors, they now see him as more of a human. But he's still got these massive advantages, not the least of which is how much capital he controls. But the undefeated label is gone.
Yeah, he's no longer undefeated. That's right. And another key point as he moves forward is that he typically went back and befriended the people he competed with. Jay Gould is the exception. Vanderbilt actually tells Gould to his face that he and the other director, this guy, Jim Fisk, are the ones responsible for his humiliation in the Erie War. He thinks that they're dishonest, that they are dishonorable for talking to the press about everything when the expectation on Wall Street at the time was to keep deals private. Of course, with all this animosity and also the fact that Jay Gould is running a pretty wounded Erie Railroad that he's struggling to keep going, Gould goes and visits Vanderbilt in November 1868, and he asks him if he is behind this lawsuit that's about to get filed against the Erie. Vanderbilt looks at him and he's like, no, I am absolutely not. He actually tells Gould, which is important, you'll know because my lawyer won't be there. Next morning, Vanderbilt's lawyer actually does show up in court, and it's a complete misunderstanding because, of course, Vanderbilt's lawyer is there. He has other clients, right? And it's a different client that is filing this, but there is zero trust between Gould and Vanderbilt at this point. And so Gould assumes Vanderbilt is behind the lawsuit and assumes that Vanderbilt is coming after the Erie.
He's trying to close the consolidation of the Central with the Hudson, and the governor is signing a bill that actually allows this to go through. Which, by the way, this creates a company the scale of which nobody has ever seen, right? This is just a behemoth company. The new entity, the New York Central and Hudson River Railroad, is going to be capitalized at $90 million. To put that in context, 20 years earlier, no corporation in the country had a capitalization of over $10 million.
Yeah, the press is already speculating, though, that Vanderbilt is going to consolidate all the way to Chicago. And so it makes sense strategically because Chicago and the Midwest, like we've been talking about, are the growth markets of the U.S. And this connection to Chicago is key for all four major trunk lines, and certainly for the Central. But Vanderbilt doesn't actually feel the need to own the lines west of Buffalo. He has these agreements in place. Some of the lines are going around Lake Erie and across Michigan. They're all working fine, but it's certainly not fine for Jay Gould and the Erie. And the Erie has this odd, wide 6-foot gauge that is not compatible with the rest of the gauges on the other lines. And so Gould starts an aggressive campaign to try to control the connecting lines to the Erie to break out of that isolation. He goes after the line that connects the Pennsylvania Railroad, which is one of the other main trunk lines to Chicago. And then he starts looking at the lines that connect Buffalo to Chicago on the southern shore of Lake Erie. This has been another fragmented market with struggling railroads that had recently been consolidated to gain some scale into a single railroad called the Lakeshore.
And the key board member of the Lakeshore, he has an epic name. His name is LeGrand Lockwood, and he hates Vanderbilt, right? And Lockwood is this powerful Wall Street broker type. He gotten burned by the Central blockade. Vanderbilt ran in 1867, so there's a lot of animosity between these guys.
Right. So Lockwood and Gould get together to negotiate an alliance in secret over the summer of 1869. They're going to divert lakeshore traffic to the Erie. They're going to lay a third rail so the standard gauge trains can run on the Erie's tracks. And essentially, they're going to cut Vanderbilt's system off from Chicago. So here we go again, right? Vanderbilt has to play defense against Gould and the Erie. But this time, Vanderbilt actually sits back and he waits because he knows that every fall, money markets in New York get tight because of the harvest and the shipment of crops. And he's probably sitting there that summer, Matt, staring intensely out of the window, waiting for the leaves to turn.
I don't know that he did much sitting at the window. He's probably out racing horses and just crushing people in Upper Manhattan.
Yeah, that's probably true, actually. So by mid-September, like clockwork, credit starts tightening and Vanderbilt dumps his Lakeshore shares over 3 days. Price collapses from 107 to 75. Lockwood had bought $1.25 million worth of Lakeshore on credit using the shares as collateral. So when the price drops 30%, he gets margin called and blows up. Like Lockwood goes to Vanderbilt, begs for mercy. Vanderbilt sends him away. And by October 1st, Lockwood is bankrupt.
Ruthless, right? So let's put this into context too, because the collateral damage here is huge. And again, Gould is all over this, but from a different angle because Gould and his buddy Fisk had been trying to corner the gold market right as Vanderbilt attacks the Lakeshore.
Yeah, they're literally trying to own as much gold as there is in New York.
Yeah, Jay Gould probably deserves his own series. This guy was such a force of nature on Wall Street, especially later in his life. But on Friday, September 24th, the whole market collapses. This is actually the original Black Friday. Gold collapses, stocks crash, 14 brokerages fail, and Vanderbilt's own position is exposed because he doesn't actually own a clear majority of the Central by himself. His friends and family own big chunks, and they bought on margin at his urging, and if they get wiped out, he could lose control of the Central.
Vanderbilt rushes back from Albany, where he had just signed the final consolidation agreement between the Central and the Hudson. He puts up $2.5 million of his own money to cover his friends' margin calls, and then he goes to Wall Street in person, and he makes a show of bidding on Central stock in full view of everyone.
Yeah, and it works, right? The brokers on the street say if Vanderbilt hadn't shown up, the whole market would have collapsed, which is, to me, so interesting, right? Today, people associate that kind of intervention with like a Warren Buffett or the Fed. But in 1869, there is no Fed, and there is no lender of last resort. The closest historical analog to what Vanderbilt does here is what JP Morgan's going to do later in the panic of 1907. And I actually wonder if JP Morgan used Vanderbilt as a model for this.
Yep.
Vanderbilt's basically a one-man central bank during this panic.
Yeah, he's kind of the source code actually for a lot of modern capitalism. But then to wrap up the story here, so he ends up winning the Lakeshore battle. He removes Lockwood and his allies from the Lakeshore board. He installs his own allies on the board and the management, and he now controls an integrated rail system from Manhattan all the way to Chicago. But he makes a key decision here. He doesn't actually consolidate the Lakeshore into the Central. He keeps them separate. He knows that public opinion at this time is kind of turning against the idea of monopolies and all this concentration of wealth and power. He knows that a formal merger across 6 state lines would be a political nightmare. And he knows that he needs to keep the connecting roads happy, the ones that he doesn't own, because they feed freight into his system. And so he governs the lakeshore by delegating to his allies, but he keeps them separate. The ruthlessness, right? Like the competitive edge is still there. You saw it when he destroyed Lockwood without even blinking. But for the first time, he actually doesn't have anything to prove necessarily. He just kind of needs the system to work. He just wants to do the work. And that restraint, despite becoming more powerful and wealthy than arguably anybody else before or since then, is pretty different from the way that he approached his previous wins.
So let's close with that. And let's review the Vanderbilt playbook for successfully navigating a technology revolution. So first off, one thing that sort of jumped off the page to me is that he actually spends the first 30 years of the railway industry's life learning the business, but not going all in, right? He doesn't get involved in building greenfield railway projects. And he only really fully dives in once the issues are in things like operations and strategy and management and finance. And on finance, you can't really mention the Vanderbilt playbook for railroads without mentioning that he was very conservative in his approach to debt at both the personal level and the corporate level. Throughout the 1860s, actually, he paid debt down mostly. And a big part of his playbook is to take advantage of competitors' weakness, which often was that they were personally very levered. We saw him do this with the Hudson and the Lakeshore.
Yeah, it's very important to call out the things he didn't do, right? Like he wasn't laying major new lines to areas without proven demand, and he wasn't trying to amplify returns with debt. He actually took advantage of competitors that did overextend themselves.
What he does do in his first move into railroads is almost straight out of Peter Thiel's book, 0 to 1, where it says every startup should start small by dominating a small market and then gradually expand. And this is what Vanderbilt was trying to do with the Harlem, which was an extremely strategic asset that no one could replicate, when he realizes that the main problem in the market is that it's way too fragmented, especially given how high fixed costs are, and that every small railroad is in a price competition with every other small railroad, and that's basically killing every company involved. So he shifts his focus to the problem of market power in a fragmented industry, and eventually takes control of the Hudson so he can coordinate the two together. And part of the reason he can do this, other than his savvy, is that he has the financial flexibility to make these moves.
His wealth is a key part of his playbook too, right? He controls a lot of capital in a really tight market where almost no one can compete with him on capital.
Yeah, and a big part of the Vanderbilt Railroad playbook was that he actually didn't really focus a ton on operations or growth until he had market power. But once he owned the whole system and had market power and could see it in the numbers, he just goes to town, making the smart operational improvements that he was really good at and the big investments in his system. Because once you have that market power, this is the next best thing you can do for your business, but not before. And he knew that.
Yeah. I want to build on that playbook a bit and tie two of Vanderbilt's decisions at the end, the decision not to consolidate the Lakeshore with the Central, and then his role catalyzing the Panic of 1869 and stabilizing the market immediately after that. I think in many ways, and TJ Stiles makes a point of this in The First Tycoon, I think Vanderbilt understood commerce better than almost anyone else at the time. And I think that he's such an independent guy. He doesn't borrow answers that he hasn't validated himself, right? Like he knows railroads and industrialization are fundamentally changing the game. They're fundamentally changing the economy. And I think he understands the way of doing things, the best practices and the regulations and the old playbooks. Those don't really work and they're not keeping up, right? The old ways of doing things were designed for a world of local businesses, of personal partnerships and very tangible assets. And the railroad is so different, so much more massive in terms of capital and in terms of scale. The sheer size of these new corporations is just orders of magnitude more than anything before them. And meanwhile, time is accelerating so much, so fast. Remember the Nicaragua line from the beginning, back in the 1850s. It took 4 to 6 months to get from the East Coast to the West Coast. And when we talk about transcontinental lines in the next episode, that's going to get cut to 7 days, right? So every mental model and every institution and even the way you think about finance and markets has to get upgraded in a world that completely changes that fast.
Yeah, you're hitting on something crazy important that we kind of danced around in the episode and I think is underappreciated when you study the history of rail. the way these rail businesses were managed and operated had to go a total and complete overhaul to absorb this technology and really make it safe and productive for everybody. This was actually one of the most fun areas to research for me for this episode. And everybody should go read the railroad chapter in Alfred Chandler's The Visible Hand to get a grasp on this and to start thinking about how we might do something similar for our businesses and organizations to get all the productivity out of AI.
Yeah, that's definitely something I'm taking away from this story, Matt. We're in the middle of a radical technological revolution right now with AI that in a lot of ways is changing the rules of the game, the best way to run businesses, right? But also the structure of most markets will change and is changing because of that. A lot of interesting ideas, some better than others, are fighting it out in the arenas of ambition all over the world. It'll be really exciting to see where things land. All right, should we leave it there?
Yeah, I feel like we're going to be studying this for the rest of our lives, and we definitely have another episode in this series coming that's going to be awesome, but let's close it up. Thank you. If you enjoyed this, as always, the best way to help us is to share this with anyone you think might like it and to leave us a 5-star rating on Spotify or Apple Podcasts. And of course, tune in for our next and final episode of Rail Revolution. See you, Daniel.
See you, Matt.